You're listening to the Naked Bible Podcast. To support this podcast, visit nakedbiblepodcast.com and click on the support link in the upper right-hand corner. If you're new to the podcast and Dr. Heiser's approach to the Bible, click on New Start Here at nakedbiblepodcast.com.
Welcome to the Naked Bible Podcast, episode 112, Ezekiel 1. I'm the layman, Trey Strickland, and he's the scholar, Dr. Michael Heiser. Hey, Mike, how you doing?
Very good. Hope you're doing well, Trey.
I'm doing pretty good. It's been a busy week, but I'm looking forward to finally getting into the book of Ezekiel.
Yeah. Yeah, and of course it starts with a bang. I mean, this is anybody who thinks of Ezekiel, this is typically the chapter they think of, either that or Gog and Magog. You're going to have to wait a while for that.
Yeah.
38 and 39, but yeah, it's either that or this one.
Well, here we go.
All right, well, we are going to cover all of Ezekiel 1 today, and in the process, we're going to be doing, essentially doing a lot of Ezekiel 10, because Ezekiel 10 is the same vision, or basically the same. So we'll be interacting with chapter 10 a little bit. Later on when we hit, chapter 10 in a sequence, we're going to be making it part of other chapters, so we'll be returning real briefly to chapter 10. But chapter 10 is, again, largely this same vision with a few differences, and we'll note the ones that are important as we go. So my goal today is to cover this chapter, the whole chapter. It's part of Ezekiel's call, which is actually really the first three chapters. Verse 1 of the book up to about Ezekiel chapter 3, around verse 15 or so, is really the fuller call of Ezekiel as a prophet. But we're only going to take this one chapter in isolation, and we'll hit the other chapters when we get to them. But my goals are pretty simple for today. I want to talk about what's being described and what's not being described. In other words, Ezekiel 1, you always get into this UFO talk, which is nonsense. So what is it? What is he seeing? What is he not seeing? And what did it mean to the original readers? And of course, by extension, to us. So let's jump in here. We're going to essentially read through the whole chapter in portions as we go. And I should preface this also by saying we're going to be doing a lot of reading of certain chapters, not just in Ezekiel during this episode. So you might want to have a Bible ready if you can. If you're in the car or something like that, it's okay to listen. But I will also be referring to a PDF that you can download from the website. So either after you're done listening to it, in the car, or if you're listening to it in a place where you can be looking at the PDF, that'll help you in places. Because we're going to talk again about what in the world Ezekiel is seeing, and there is iconographic material that you can look at and see the elements of Ezekiel's vision. So let's just jump in here with the first three verses, because there's an issue here that we want to say something about here. So in terms of the book, chapter 1, let's just jump in right where it starts. In the 30th year, in the 4th month, on the 5th day of the month, as I was among the exiles by the Kivar Canal, the heavens were opened, and I saw visions of God. On the 5th day of the month, it was the 5th year of the exile of King Jehoiakim, the word of the Lord came to Ezekiel the priest, the son of Buzi, in the land of the Chaldeans by the Kivar Canal, and the hand of the Lord was upon him there. And we commented in the last episode introducing the book that here you have a switch between first and third person, and it's evidence of editorial activity. We're not going to rehearse that. But as I also mentioned last time in our introduction, Ezekiel's known for giving lots of dates. There are 15 of them actually given in the book. And there's an important date here, or at least one that people wonder about, right here in the first three verses. So it states that, the text states that Ezekiel had visions of God in the 30th year. Well, what is that? Because later he says on the 5th day of the month, it was the 5th year of the exile of King Jehoiakim. So what 30th year is he talking about? And it's frankly just not clear. So it's sort of a mystery, and commentators have wondered what the 30th year refers to, and what is its relationship to the 5th year that comes in the very next verse, verse 2. So the options are they both references to the same event, maybe from a different perspective, using a different calendar? Or is the 30th year an indication that Ezekiel's words were written down many years later, In other words, after the 5th year of Jehoiakim's exile. Is that what it means? Does the 30th year mean that the prophet was 30 years old at the time he was exiled, which in that case it would have been about 622 BC for a birth, of Ezekiel. Then he would have been 30 years old. We're in the 590s, as we talked about in the introductory episode. Another option is, does the 30th year, is the meaning of that since some other important event that we're just not told about and we're supposed to know? Some scholars, who opt for this solution suggest that maybe Ezekiel's referring to the finding of the law in the temple by Josiah's people, his reformers. And that would have been around 622 as well, according to 2 Kings 22:8. All of these are things you'll see about in the literature. Now, Dan Block, and I'm going to be referring to his Ezekiel commentary a couple times here, and I'm sure occasionally in other episodes. Block prefers the option that he thinks the 30th year is Ezekiel's birthday. And this is actually an interpretive option that arose with Origen, the famous patristic father. And he thinks it makes sense because of the first person language in 1:1, then the switch to the third person later on, which allows for, again, a change of perspective. Somebody else writing about 5th year and all that stuff of King Jehoiakim. And, personally, I think that makes good sense. I'm not going to really say too much more about it. It's certainly workable. All the options, of course, are going to have their defenders, but in case you were wondering, because I mentioned last time there was this one outlier date, that's it. And again, that's sort of where I land. But what we really want to do in this episode is not, quibble about dates and this thing. We want to get into the actual vision. And this is really the rest of the chapter. So we're going to be reading through the chapter. And again, there's a PDF on the episode website that you can open and look at. And I'll sort of give you a heads up when you might want to look at it. That is useful. Ezekiel, as we'll find out, or as, again, this is part of the PDF that you'll actually be able to see the rationale for this. Ezekiel was borrowing divine imagery that would have been familiar to the Babylonians. And of course, the Jews are exiled in Babylon. So the Jews are no doubt going to see these kinds of images and this kind of imagery. So they would have been familiar with it as well. So he's borrowing, again, divine imagery that the Babylonians are going to understand, that the Jews in Babylon are going to understand. I would say the Jews even wider, because some of this is going to get into what we call divine throne chariot imagery, and Jews in their own homeland would have been familiar with that. And even more particularly, we're going to talk about, as we talk about the vision's relationship to the temple, the decorations of the temple, and the accoutrements, the furniture. Again, we're going to see that what Ezekiel sees is really directly drawn from the temple, because he's describing a heavenly temple. And so Jews would have been familiar with this as well, but people in Babylon would have understood it equally. So he's doing this to inform his audience that the God of Israel was the true God and still active, even though they're in Babylon. And so the use of ancient Near Eastern imagery and some of the, again, iconography from the temple, this is going to become important for understanding what Ezekiel is describing and conversely what he's not talking about at all, what the vision has no relationship to, against some of these modern myths like, oh, he's looking at a UFO. Again, the imagery that he uses is well known to both Babylonians and Jews. Now, the images that I'll be talking about come from a specific source, and this is noted in the PDF as well. The famous German scholar Othmar Kiel, this is his specialty, iconography of the ancient Near Eastern world, and specifically as it relates to the Bible. Unfortunately, the book's in German, but it's Jahwe Visionen und Siegelkunst, eine neue Deutung der Majestatschilderungen in Isaiah, Ezekiel 1 and 10, und Zach 4, Zechariah 4. So visions of Yahweh and seal art is the English translation. A new interpretation of the majestic portrayals in Isaiah 6, Ezekiel 1 and 10, and Zechariah 4. So, again, I'm appealing to a specialist here for the imagery that you're going to see in the PDF. Let's just jump into the text, and I'll tell you again give you a heads up when you might want to look at that. So verse 4, Ezekiel writes, "As I looked, behold, a stormy wind came out of the north, and a great cloud with brightness around it, and fire flashing forth continually, and in the midst of the fire, as it were, gleaming metal." Now we'll stop there. That's verse 4. This is your first clue as to what he's actually looking at. Stormy wind, great cloud. This is stock vocabulary of what biblical scholars call the storm theophany motif, okay? God often comes, whether in human form ultimately, or you never get to that kind of description, but God often comes and encounters people in a storm cloud. You get a lot of this imagery in Job. You get a lot of it in the Psalms. You get some of it in the Torah. Again, this is not unfamiliar. This has nothing to do with smoke coming out of a combustion engine, right? Stormy wind, great cloud. This is stock vocabulary for a storm theophany. Now, the gleaming metal, it doesn't say that he's looking at an object made of gleaming metal. He's looking at a cloud. He's looking at a cloud, and the cloud has fire, again, some sort of fiery luminescence in the middle of it, in the manner of gleaming metal, as it were gleaming metal. And this gleaming appearance is going to be referred to in verse 27 later on, as we'll see. And it's also in chapter 8, verse 2, if you wanted to go look up other instances of it. Verse 5, "And from the midst of it," again, the cloud he's looking at, "from the midst of it came the likeness of 4 living creatures. And this was their appearance. They had a human likeness, but each had 4 faces, and each of them had 4 wings. Their legs were straight, and the soles of their feet were like the soles of a calf's foot. And they sparkled like burnished bronze." So they have a luminescent appearance as well. The cloud from which they emerged does. Again, there's this radiant, gleaming, flashing sort of, light brightness. But also these creatures, again, have this quality as well. Verse 8, "Under their wings, on their 4 sides, they had human hands. And the 4 had their faces and their wings thus. Their wings touched one another. Each one of them went straight forward without turning as they went. As for the likeness of their faces, each had a human face. The 4 had the face of a lion on the right side. The 4 had the face of an ox on the left side, and the 4 had a face of an eagle." So they have 4 faces. "Such were their faces, and their wings were spread out above. Each creature had 2 wings, each of which touched the wing of another, while 2 covered their bodies. And each went straight forward. Wherever the Spirit would go, they went, without turning as they went. As for the likeness of the living creatures, their appearance was like burning coals of fire, like the appearance of torches moving to and fro among the living creatures. And the fire was bright, and out of the fire went forth lightning, and the living creatures darted to and fro like the appearance of a flash of lightning." Again, we'll stop there. We'll end with verse 14 here. But again, lightning is a stock element of a storm theophany. This is a vision of God. And the vision of God is associated here with these creatures. Now, the creatures are identified in chapter 10 when this vision is repeated. There they are called cherubim, karuvim, okay? So we have this vision of God. He is associated with the presence of cherubim, which should not shock anyone because, hey, guess what? Back in the Torah, the place where God's presence was, again, the lid of the ark had cherubim on it. Again, this is not going to be unfamiliar. In the temple, not only did you have the Ark of the Covenant with the 2 cherubim, but you had the 2 giant cherubim on either side of the throne. Guess what? 2 and 2 equals 4. You got 4 cherubim in the temple. Well, lo and behold, you got 4 cherubim here too. What a coincidence. Again, it's not a coincidence. We're going to go through this material, and I think in some instances you're going to be kind of shocked at what you can actually find said about the temple that you find in Ezekiel 1. Again, we often don't think of it this way. We think of it as sort of this isolated, kind of event and vision with no, context to it. But, it's not that case at all. We have, a situation here where the writer is referencing something that's familiar to his Jewish audience. Now, in terms of a list, here's what we've seen so far. We've got 4 living creatures, cherubim. They are human in appearance, at least in part, and they're creaturely in part. They have creature, animal, features and human features, a combination. Each had human hands, for instance. They have 4 faces. One of those faces was human. They each have 4 wings, and their legs are straight, and their feet, are both the legs and the feet are sort of bovine. They're like calves' legs and calves' feet. Now, at this point, if you have access to the PDF, you should start taking a look at it, because every one of these features is known in the same kind of context from Babylonian iconography, or, as we just mentioned a few minutes ago, or the temple. So again, in the temple, we've got the cherubim. They're partly human in appearance. They have the wings, though. There are 4 of them in the temple. Again, you don't have the 4 faces in those cherubim, but you have a mixture of human and animal features. Their wings, again, are touching in the temple. They're also touching in the Ark of the Covenant, the tabernacle. They are also partly bovine, because we know this from the iconography. Now, karuv, cherub, is a term that comes from Akkadian. There's your Babylonian context. And everybody in Babylon, and of course any Jew in Babylon, or any Jew who had seen a Babylonish throne or a Babylonish maybe idol that was associated with an enthroned deity or a king, would have known what this was. And they would have been familiar with all of these features, what a karuv, what a cherub looked like, and consequently what cherubim look like. This is an Akkadian term that refers to a quasi-divine figure that guarded a divine throne or a king's throne. Again, the context is perfectly consistent here. This is an image of God, and as we're going to see, out of the cloud or in the cloud is the enthroned deity, Yahweh of Israel. His throne is going to be described. And this language, this description, is actually, again, going to be found elsewhere, either in temple descriptions or other passages like Daniel 7, where you have the seated deity, the God, the Ancient of Days, in that case, on the throne. That throne is going to have wheels and fire and the whole bit. Again, this is not foreign imagery. An ancient person, an ancient Jew or an ancient Babylonian, would not have read this and thought, good grief, I don't know what this is, because they'd never actually seen a flying saucer. Again, this kind of thinking that this is a UFO or a flying saucer is absurd. Nobody would have wondered what he was describing. They wouldn't have been clueless. They would have known immediately what this was, both in terms of texts that describe the features and iconography of the day. So let's go on in verse 15. Now, as I looked at the living creatures, I saw a wheel on the earth beside the living creatures, one for each of the 4 of them. As for the appearance of the wheels and their construction, their appearance was like the gleaming of beryl, and the 4 had the same likeness, their appearance and construction being, as it were, a wheel within a wheel. So you have these intersecting wheels. When they went in any of their 4 directions, without turning as they went. And their rims were tall and awesome, and the rims of all 4 were full of eyes all around. And when the living creatures went, the wheels went beside them. And when the living creatures rose from the earth, the wheels rose. Whenever the Spirit wanted to go, or wherever the Spirit wanted to go, they went, and the wheels rose along with them. For the spirit of the living creatures was in the wheels. When those went, these went. And when those stood, these stood. And when those rose from the earth, the wheels rose along with them. For the spirit of the living creatures was in the wheels. We'll stop there. That's the end of verse 21. Now you notice that the quote, I'll use a modern term here, the quote propulsion of this thing is not the fire, and it's not the radiance. It's the 4 creatures. Why? because chariot thrones, and again, that's what this is, as we're going to find out, and as again, any Babylonian would know from the description of the cherubim. Cherubim throne iconography, you can look at the PDF, was very well known. Cherubim pulled divine thrones, or they carried divine thrones. Okay, they were the propulsion of the divine chariot, either a chariot that they would use on earth to pull around an idol or pull around a king who was, depending on the culture, would have been conceived of as divine. And of course, a heavenly version of this, you need heavenly creatures as well. Again, cherubim, but this time again they're alive, they're animated. They're not just, again, part of the statuary, that sort of thing. Everybody would have known what this was. And so the propulsion, again, would have been viewed as, for the heavenly chariot, these creatures. So we don't have a rocket engine. We don't have some sort of propulsion system that the light, the radiant appearance is indicative of. We don't have that. The text is quite clear. The propulsion, quote unquote, again, using the modern term, has nothing to do with the fire or the radiance. Again, everybody would have known what this was. And again, I'm throwing this in here because I get this kind of question all the time. You see it on the internet. You see it on Ancient Aliens and that sort of thing. Supposedly we have UFOs in the Bible. This is sort of the go-to chapter. We don't. Okay, this wasn't a UFO with internal combustion engines or any other kind of radiant power source. That is not what's being described in the text. The mode of propulsion is the spirit, quote unquote, which is in the creatures. Okay, it has nothing to do, again, with some sort of fiery propulsion. It's a throne chariot, heavenly throne chariot being pulled by cherubim. And again, because we have the pictures, think of the iconography that you see in the PDF as the Polaroids of the day. Polaroid kind of dates me, but the digital photo of the day, okay? We know what Ezekiel was describing. We know what he saw for two reasons. One, the pictures, the iconography, and two, this language is drawn directly from the temple, as we'll see in a moment. So there's no mystery here. There's no mystery. Now, let's just jump back in with verse 22. Keep going. Over the heads of the living creatures there was the likeness of an expanse, shining like awe-inspiring crystals spread out above their heads. And under the expanse their wings were stretched out straight, one toward another, and each creature had two wings covering its body. And when they went, I heard the sound of their wings like the sound of many waters, like the sound of the Almighty, a sound of tumult, like the sound of an army. When they stood still, they let down their wings, and there came a voice from above the expanse over their heads. When they stood still, they let down their wings. Verse 26, and above the expanse over their heads, there was the likeness of a throne. Okay, there you go, point blank. This is a chariot cherubim throne. Everyone in the ancient world, Babylon and the Jews, knew precisely what this was. Okay, since we don't see those things all the time, we have this propensity, at least some people do, of imposing something modern into the text. Namely, like what Ancient Aliens does, is impose a UFO here. Okay? Nobody reading this text or hearing it, again, or frankly composing it, that is not what they were seeing. We know what they were seeing. We have the pictures. We have the texts. This is not a flying saucer. So back to verse 26 again. Above the expanse over their heads there was the likeness of a throne, in appearance like sapphire. Oh, well, Mike, what about the sapphire experience here? We'll stop here a moment. Well, guess what? The same description is rendered in Exodus 24:10. What happens in Exodus 24:10, verses 9 and so? That's when Moses and Aaron and other people went up into the mountain at Sinai, and they, quote, saw the God of Israel, unquote, and they have a meal with him. So again, it's a mountain. It's Sinai. ancient people know what mountains are. They're not describing some kind of circular silvery craft or whatever, a UFO that they're climbing into. Okay, it's a mountain. And it's the same mountain that is referred to throughout the book of Exodus. Same geography, same location. Again, I hate to belabor what seems like really obvious points, but to the people whose worldview is framed by shows like Ancient Aliens, you can never beat the obvious drum too often. Again, to hopefully get people to actually look at the material, look at the data. You have the same description in Exodus 24:10 when they are in God's house, so to speak, to have a meal, as you do right here in Ezekiel 1. So again, back to verse 26. Above the expanse over their heads, there was the likeness of a throne in appearance like sapphire, and seated above the likeness of a throne was a likeness with a human appearance. Again, we have the embodied deity here. We have God as a man, okay, on this throne. It really, frankly, couldn't be clearer. It's just not clear to us who are culturally removed, and frankly to people who just don't want it to be clear. They want it to be about something bizarre, like Ancient Aliens. Verse 27, and upward from what had the appearance of his waist, I saw as it were gleaming metal, like the appearance of fire enclosed all around. And downward from what had the appearance of his waist, I saw as it were the appearance of fire. And there was brightness around him, like the appearance of the bow that is in the cloud on the day of rain. So was the appearance of the brightness all around. Such was the appearance of the likeness of the glory of the Lord. Now, right there he tells you, this was the appearance. What I'm looking at is the glory of the Lord. And when I saw it, I fell on my face and heard the voice of one speaking. That's the end of the chapter. Now, a couple observations, again, linked to this. 3 observations to be specific. Before we move on and we talk about the meaning and interpretation of all this, we need to build some context for the meaning and the interpretation. So again, 3 observations here. Number 1 is just what I mentioned here at the end of the chapter. In Ezekiel 1, 22 through 28, the focus is the glory of the Lord. Now, we've talked about this before in an older podcast episode about the resurrection body in 1 Corinthians 15. There's this thing about the quote, the spiritual body, the celestial body. And we talked in that early episode, about how this language is drawn from Ezekiel and some other passages. Ezekiel calls the figure on the throne the glory of the Lord in Ezekiel 1:28. We just read it. In Ezekiel 9:3, though, it's referred to as the glory of the God of Israel and also the divine name, Yahweh. To make the point even more clearly, if you compare Ezekiel 1, 22, and 28, again, these references to the cherubim who are in Ezekiel 1, they are under the, quote, glory, under the glory. If you look at the same description in Ezekiel 10, verse 20, there the cherubim are under, quote, the God of Israel. Okay, there's no ambiguity here. This is not just some luminous, formless array of light. This is God in human form. This is the God of Israel. The glory of the Lord in this passage is this humanoid appearance of Yahweh of Israel. Again, you just have to compare a few passages with each other, and you get to the point. Yahweh is the glory, and the glory has form here. There's a body there. It is a body, all right? And so this language, again, is going to work itself out in other passages, including the New Testament. If you want to go listen to that earlier podcast episode, please do. Again, when we talked about Paul and the spiritual body and that whole concept. So the source of the shining, radiant, and the gleaming language, again, was not an inanimate object. It's not a craft. It's not the platform that the throne is on. It's not even the throne itself. The source of the shining, radiant light is the deity. Okay, it's the deity, the enthroned deity who happens to be in the cloud. And hello, does that sound familiar? Does that sound familiar to what Moses talks, who Moses talks to? The whole thing about Moses going into the cloud comes down over the tent of meeting. Moses goes into the cloud to talk to the God of Israel, to talk to Yahweh. We've already referenced Exodus 24, again, where they see the God of Israel. In that case, it's more than just Moses. But again, this is language that any Jew who would have been familiar with the temple and the tabernacle descriptions in the Torah, and even these episodes in the Torah where God in human form is encountered, there would have been no mystery here as to what is being described. So that's the first, again, observation I want to reinforce. Secondly, if we go to Ezekiel 10, we need to say a little bit something about the cherubim. Again, what I'm doing with these three observations is sort of setting up what the meaning of all this is, how to interpret it. So the second item is the cherubim in Ezekiel 10. There are a few differences in the description there with what we have here in chapter 1. Now I'm going to quote from Dan Block's commentary here, his Ezekiel commentary in the New International Commentary in the Old Testament series, the Nikot series. So he has here, and this is his commentary on verse 12 and following. He writes, first, verse 12 is particularly confusing as images of wheels seem to merge with the images of the cherubim. And we're in chapter 10 now. The problem is not helped by the retrospective pronouns, their bodies, their backs, unquote, because whose bodies and whose backs are we talking about? Are the wheels of the previous paragraph now transformed into some type of angelic figure with four faces and body parts? Are the wheels transformed into a special class of angels, which is a motif that becomes important in later Jewish mysticism? What's known, this is me now talking, this is known as Merkava mysticism. There was a whole school of Jewish thought and writing, mystical Judaism, that wrote about this vision and assigned mystical meaning to it. Kind of like Kabbalah, okay? Again, it's sort of the mystical Jewish school of thought, so to speak. A lot of that's centered around this vision. And in that later literature, you actually have angels, creatures called ophanim, which are wheels. So you get the mixture in that later literature. So Block is raising the question here. But back to Block, he says, it seems more natural to apply the bodies, backs, heads, hands, and wings to the cherubim, mentioned previously here in this chapter 10, verse 9, which is grammatically possible. So what Block is saying is, look, even though it sounds different in chapter 10, grammatically, you can look at it and analyze the grammar and say, well, he's basically describing the same thing back in chapter 1. We don't have a merging of these things here. Continuing with Block on verse 14 in chapter 10, he writes, second, the description of the cherubim's faces differs significantly from the earlier account, whereas Ezekiel 1:10, had ascribed 4 different faces to each of the cherubim. The plain reading of the Hebrew here points to 4 identical faces for each cherub, with each cherub having a different set. Whereas Ezekiel 1:10 had followed a human, lion, bull, eagle sequence, Ezekiel 10:14 lists them as cherub, human, lion, eagle. This reordering raises 2 questions. Why was the bull face displaced? In other words, why don't you have a reference to a bull in chapter 10? And how is the cherubic face to be perceived? Because you don't have that in chapter 1. There's this swapping going on. While we cannot be sure how the ancients perceived true cherubic faces, again, there's variety there, some evidence suggests that they were not human. Their faces were not human. And he has a footnote here. I'm going to read the footnote. He says, according to a 7th century BC Akkadian text, again, that would have been a little bit before the writing of Ezekiel, called or named Namtartu, or about Namtartu, the concubine Namtartu, the vizier of the underworld, this in Akkadian religion. According to a 7th century BC text about Namtartu, Namtartu had the head of a koribu, cherub, but human hands and feet. I would also add, this is, again, Block speaking in the footnote, I would also add that since the bodies of cherubim were predominantly bovine, again, like cattle, oxen, bulls, that sort of thing, having the term karuv here instead of ox or bull from chapter 1 is a distinction without a difference. And I would agree with that. This is me talking now. Again, since This is the way Cheruvim predominantly were. They had all these bovine features. It really doesn't make much difference if you use Cheruv in chapter 10 as opposed to the word for ox or bull, the Hebrew word is shor, in chapter 1. It is a distinction without a difference. It's basically the same thing. So Bloch says, on the other hand, the contradiction, at least in the order of faces, would then be more apparent than real. And again, I agree. Now, on the order, again, we're setting up, again, our discussion of what all this means. Bloch writes this, and you could look for this not only there's a graphic Bloch uses in his commentary. I put it in the PDF about the order of the faces. He writes, since the inaugural vision, that's the first vision in chapter 1, came to the prophet from the north, the frontal view, okay, which would have been south, would have a human face, with the other three being arranged as follows. Now, again, if you're looking at the PDF, you're going to get this arrangement that Bloch talks about, where you have, north is eagle, east is bull, west is lion, south is human. So you're going to get this, arrangement that is a little bit, at least on the surface, seems a little bit different than what you get in chapter 1. But here's what Bloch says. If the faces in chapter 10, verse 14, are also listed in clockwise order, the sequence is actually identical with chapter 1. Again, it just depends where you start the sequence, in other words. And the cherubs is identified with the bull. So there you would have the cherub and the bull in the same position. And we set it up, just a few minutes ago, that Cheruv and bull, shor in Hebrew, is really a distinction without a difference anyway. So Bloch writes, why the present enumeration commences with the Cheruv, with the cherub instead of the human face is unclear, but it may reflect the vantage point from which the prophet observed the chariot. In order to witness the kavod, the glory, lifting from cherubim inside the temple, he must have been standing at the front of the building, perhaps at the eastern gate of the inner court. From this viewpoint, he naturally began with the creature facing him. Beyond these changes, the description of the chariot agrees with the earlier account and requires no further comment. Again, I would agree with Bloch here that there's no contradiction between what chapter 10 says and what chapter 1 says. You just have to, again, do the sort of thing that Bloch is doing, and I've reproduced some of this text in the PDF so you have it. You have to sort of ask yourself certain interpretive questions to be able to align chapter 10 with chapter 1. Thirdly, again, we'll come back to this, the faces in a moment when we get to meaning and interpretation, but one more item to observe here to set all that up. Third is Daniel 7. Daniel 7 has some of the same features as Ezekiel 1. And in Daniel 7, we have a divine council meeting. The divine council is meeting for the purpose of dealing with world empires of the present and future. Again, that's the first 8 verses of chapter 7. The message, of course, that's going to be put to the audience, put to the reader, is that God is in charge of these empires. The council participates in God's decision about the fate of those empires. So again, Daniel 7 is pretty familiar, and you get this image of the 4 beasts, the first 8 verses, and so we need to have a council meeting to decide what's going to happen with these beasts. And you get to verses 9 and 10, and we read this. These are very familiar if you've followed my content for any amount of time. Daniel 7, 9, and 10, Daniel says, as I looked, thrones, plural, were placed, and the Ancient of Days took his seat. Now, that's a reference again to a seated council, not the Ancient of Days and the Son of Man, because the Son of Man is never described as taking a seat. The Jewish interpretation likes to limit it to 2, to both deny the council idea and also, again, to try to link this to the Son of David. Again, it's unnecessary, and frankly, it's not good exegesis. But as I looked, thrones were placed, and the Ancient of Days took his seat. His clothing was white as snow, and the hair of his head like pure wool. His throne was fiery flames. Its wheels were burning fire. So there you have throne, flames, and wheels in this vision that no one would suggest is a UFO. Again, that's the point. Everybody who wants to talk about the UFO in Ezekiel 1, they never tell you about Daniel 7, where it's clearly a throne in a meeting room, sort of in a boardroom, to decide the fate of these 4 beasts. can there's no way to squeeze a UFO inside the boardroom, that sort of thing. It doesn't have at all any sort of context that would support a flying craft. It just doesn't. But the people who want to prop up this Ezekiel 1 UFO thing, they never take you to Daniel 7 or any of the other stuff that we're going to be talking about in the time that remains. So verse 9, his throne was fiery flames, its wheels were burning fire. A stream of fire issued and came out from before him. 1,000,000 served him, and 10,000 times 10,000 stood before him. The court, again, the council, sat in judgment, and the books were open. Again, this is a very familiar divine council scene that helps us process Ezekiel 1 because of the references to the fire and the wheels, which are referred to many times in Ezekiel 1 and Ezekiel 10. Now, what do we do with all that? As far as interpretation and meaning, again, I've hinted at where we're going to go with this already, but Ezekiel's vision is clearly a vision of God's throne, the enthroned glory, again, God in human form, the enthroned deity. It is no more a flying saucer than the Israelite temple was a flying saucer. Now, why say it that way? Because of the high degree of correlation between this vision and, number one, Old Testament temple descriptions, and number two, its correlation with the heavenly temple scene in the book of Revelation in chapters 4 and 5. God's heavenly throne is a chariot throne. The Hebrew term is Merkavah. It has wheels, but it's still a throne. Now let's take both of these things, this correlation between Old Testament temple descriptions and the correlation with the throne description, the throne scene in Revelation 4 and 5. So first off, the Old Testament temple structure, believe it or not, this might sound kind of shocking, but the Old Testament temple structure, its furnishings, its accoutrements, the whole complex, the whole temple thing, had wheels, axles, cherubim, and most of the animal imagery from Ezekiel 1 and Ezekiel 10's cherubim. Now you think, well, I don't remember reading this stuff about the temple. Wheels? Axles? What in the world? I'll go even a step further. Even the chariot idea, the throne chariot, is present in Solomon's temple. We just miss these things because, let's be honest, the passages about how the temple was built and decorated are boring. We just don't care about that stuff. If we read it, we skim it, and typically we'll skip it. But I'm going to torture you a little bit here with reading some of these descriptions about the building of the temple and the decoration of the temple, the objects in the temple, and you're going to see these things pop out at you that you just read about in Ezekiel 1. Now listen, this is 1 Kings 6, 23 through 28. In the inner sanctuary, he made 2 cherubim of olive wood, each 10 cubits high. 5 cubits was the length of one wing of the cherub, and 5 cubits the length of the other wing of the cherub. It was 10 cubits from the tip of one wing to the tip of the other. The other cherub also measured 10 cubits. Both cherubim had the same measure and the same form. The height of one cherub was 10 cubits, and so was that of the other cherub. He put the cherubim in the innermost part of the house. And the wings of the cherubim were spread out so that the wing of one touched the one wall, and the wing of the other touched the other wall, and their other wings touched each other in the middle of the house. And he overlaid the cherubim with gold. Okay, that's the end of the passage. So here we have 2 cherubim, the wings touching. Again, this part's familiar to most listeners, most readers. Of course, we also have 2 cherubim with the Ark of the Covenant that's in the same temple complex. The Ark serves as God's footstool as he's seated on this particular giant throne. Again, if you've read Unseen Realm, this is familiar to you. So we have 4 cherubim inside the Holy of Holies, where God sits, the divine throne. Well, we have 4 cherubim in Ezekiel 1. Okay, let's keep going with another passage. 1 Chronicles 28, 11 to 18. Then David gave Solomon his son the plan of the vestibule of the temple, and of its houses, its treasuries, its upper rooms, and its inner chambers, and of the room for the mercy seat. and the plan of all that he had in mind for the courts of the house of the Lord, all the surrounding chambers, the treasuries of the house of God, and the treasuries for dedicated gifts, for the divisions of the priests and of the Levites, and all the work of the service in the house of the Lord, for all the vessels for the service of the house of the Lord, the weight of gold for all the golden vessels for each service, the weight of silver vessels for each service, the weight of the golden lampstands, the lamps, the weight of the gold for each lampstand and its lamps, and the weight of the silver for a lampstand and its lamps, according to the use of each lampstand in the service, the weight of gold for each table for the showbread, and the silver for the silver tables, and pure gold for the forks, the basins, and the cups, for the golden bowls and the weight of each, for the silver bowls and the weight of each. And you're probably snoring by now, but here you hit verse 18. Now listen to this. I read these preceding verses to make it clear that we're talking about the temple. Okay, we're not talking about objects that are associated with anything but the inner house of God. Okay, here you get for verse 18. This is the temple. This is 1 Chronicles 28. It says this: for the altar of incense made of refined gold and its weight, also David gave Solomon his plan for the golden chariot of the cherubim that spread their wings and covered the ark of the covenant of the Lord. In the Hebrew text, the word for chariot in verse 18 there is, you guessed it, Merkavah. The temple of Solomon had a throne chariot. Now, I guarantee that nobody that's trying to make Ezekiel 1 into a UFO will ever show you that verse, because it destroys the whole idea. This is why I said at the beginning, the vision of Ezekiel 1 is no more a UFO than the Temple of Solomon was a UFO. Okay, it just wasn't. It was a building, okay, inside of which there was a throne for God to sit on, okay? This is not anything unusual. It's not anything shocking or revelatory in Ezekiel 1. Every blasted Jew who had ever seen the temple, okay, and had ever heard anything about what's inside the temple, or ever saw it being built and saw the objects being built, everybody would know what this is. Let's go to another passage. 1 Kings 7, verse 13. And King Solomon sent and brought Hiram from Tyre. He was the son of a widow of the tribe of Naphtali, and his father was a man of Tyre, a worker in bronze. And he was full of wisdom, understanding, and skill for making any work in bronze. He came to Solomon and did all his work. Again, I'm establishing that we're talking about the temple here. He cast 2 pillars of bronze. 18 cubits was the height of one pillar, and a line of 12 cubits measured its circumference. It was hollow, and its thickness was 4 fingers. The second pillar was the same. He also made 2 capitals, things to put on top of the pillars, of cast bronze to set on the tops of the pillars. The height of the one capital was 5 cubits. The height of the other capital was 5 cubits. There were lattices of checker work with wreaths of chain work for the capitals on the tops of the pillars, a lattice for the one capital, a lattice for the other capital, and so on and so forth. And you get this whole description of the 2 pillars. And around verse, 21, he set up the pillars at the vestibule of the temple. He set up the pillar on the south and called its name Yakin. And he set up the pillar on the north and called its name Boaz. And on the tops of the pillars was lily work. Thus the work of the pillars was finished. And then in verse 23, he, Hiram, made the sea of cast metal. It was round, 10 cubits from brim to brim, and 5 cubits high, and a line of 30 cubits measured its circumference. Under its brim were gourds for 10 cubits, compassing the sea all around. The gourds were in 2 rows, cast with it when it was cast. It stood on 12 oxen, 3 facing north, 3 facing west, 3 facing south, and 3 facing east. Hint, I'll stop here. Those are the cardinal points, okay? Cardinal direction points. Back to the text. The sea was set on them, and all their rear parts were inward. Its thickness was a handbreadth, and its brim was made like the brim of a cup. Like the flower of a lily, it held 2,000 baths. Verse 27, he made the 10 stands of bronze. Each stand was 4 cubits long. These are stands that they're going to put, certain furniture items on so they can wheel them around. Wheel, okay. Just hold on. We'll get there in a second. Each stand was 4 cubits long, 4 cubits wide, 3 cubits high. This was the construction of the stands. They had panels, and panels were set in the frames. And on the panels that were set in the frames were lions, oxen, and cherubim. Does that sound familiar? On the frames, both above and below the lions and oxen, there were wreaths of beveled work. Moreover, each stand had 4 bronze wheels and axles of bronze. And at the 4 corners were supports for a basin. The supports were cast with wreaths at the side of each. Go down to verse 32. And the 4 wheels were underneath the panels. The axle of the wheels were of one piece with the stands. The height of a wheel was 1.5 cubits. The wheels were made like chariot wheels. Their axles, their rims, their spokes, and their hubs were all cast. There were 4 supports at the 4 corners of each stand. The supports were of one piece with the stands. Verse 35, and on the top of the stand there was a round band 0.5 cubit high, and on the top of the stand its stays and its panels were of one piece with it. And on the surface of its stays and on its panels he carved cherubim, lions, and palm trees, according to the space of each, with wreaths all around. Again, what's happening here, the point here, is that Ezekiel's vision borrows basically every feature in it from Solomon's temple and its furnishings, the whole temple complex. Ezekiel borrows all of the elements, and he sort of amalgamates them into one heavenly throne thing. Okay, because the temple it's not destroyed in Ezekiel 1. It's going to be destroyed while Ezekiel's in Babylon. But the point is that God isn't isolated to Israel. He's not isolated to Jerusalem in this temple. God is still on the throne over all of the heavens. This is why, again, the vision of Ezekiel puts all of this temple imagery together into a heavenly throne, and we'll get to it in a few moments. The 4 faces of the cherubim, many of you have heard me say this before, but the 4 faces of the cherubim in Ezekiel's vision point to the cardinal points of the zodiac. Again, the whole messaging is that God is in charge. He is enthroned upon these creatures who are pointing and can move to all the corners of the earth, so to speak, every place on the earth that is encompassed again by the whole heavens. God is over it all. Not Marduk or not some other flunky deity of the Babylonians. Yes, we are in exile in Babylon, and life is not good. It's bad. But Yahweh is not isolated to this little spot in this temple in Jerusalem, in the territory of Judah, the kingdom of Judah. He's just not. So Ezekiel wants the Jews to know that God is still ruling over everything, no matter if there is a temple or not, because there's a heavenly temple. It's the whole cosmos, as it were. It's everything that they know exists. Heaven and earth, every direction. Nothing escapes the sovereignty of the God of Israel. This is the whole point. This is why the temple imagery is borrowed, and it's why the faces are what they are. You look at what happens in Revelation 4 and 5. Okay, it's the same thing. You go to Revelation 4, it has a very strong correlation with Ezekiel, especially Ezekiel 10, when you get to the animal imagery. I'll read here in in Revelation 4, verse 1. John says, "After this I looked, and behold, a door standing open in heaven. And the first voice which I heard speaking to me like a trumpet said, 'Come up here, and I will show you what must take place after this.' At once I was in the Spirit, and behold, a throne stood in heaven with one seated on the throne." Okay, we're in heaven. There's a heavenly throne. "And he who sat there had the appearance of jasper and carnelian, and around the throne was a rainbow." Again, does that sound familiar, like the rainbow? Okay, Ezekiel. "That had the appearance of an emerald." You have shining, luminous jewels here, again, giving off radiance. Verse 4, "Around the throne were 24 thrones, and seated on the thrones were 24 elders, clothed in white garments with golden crowns on their heads. From the throne came flashes of lightning, Sound familiar? And rumblings and peals of thunder, and before the throne were burning 7 torches of fire, which are the 7 spirits of God. Does that sound familiar? And before the throne there was, as it were, a sea of glass like crystal. And around the throne, on each side of the throne, are 4 living creatures full of eyes. Oh, now the creatures are full of eyes, in front and behind. Verse 7, the first living creature like a lion, the second living creature like an ox, the third living creature with the face of a man, and the fourth living creature like an eagle in flight. And the 4 living creatures, each of them with 6 wings, were full of eyes all around and within, and day and night they never ceased to say, Holy, holy, holy is the Lord God Almighty, who was and is to come. Now that, again, is clearly a throne. It's clearly imagery borrowed from Ezekiel. There's also a few elements borrowed from the throne room scene. Again, same kind of scene, throne room scene in Isaiah 6. Again, and all of it can be found in temple descriptions in the Old Testament. Again, the point is that God's rulership, his sovereign power, is not limited to this little structure in Jerusalem, and even to Jerusalem itself, even to Judah. It is everything. Again, the heavenly throne room image and imagery tries to convey, again, the sense that God is sovereign everywhere, over the 4 corners of the earth, over everything, everyone, every empire. Now, in terms of meaning, again, you can consult the PDF for this. Again, I've made the point before, and I have some selections in there, some screenshots of books from Google Books. Maybe just one from a book. There's other books that are referenced there, though. The faces of the cherubim in Ezekiel's vision correspond to the 4 cardinal points of the zodiac known to the Babylonians and therefore to other, peoples, other literatures as well. I mean, because Babylon was known, again, for the astronomical imagery. It's not that Jews didn't have their own understanding of the zodiac. They do. You get references to constellations within and without of the zodiac in the Hebrew Bible. They know this stuff. They know what it is. But here you are in Babylon. I mean, while the Jews are in Babylon, they're going to get their month names, from Babylonian names. And there's a cross-fertilization here in terms of terminology, but you get the same understanding. I mean, the Jews are going to have their own people who pay attention to the heavens just like the Babylonians do, but in terms of what the Jews believe about what's going on up there and who's in charge of it, that's quite a bit different than what the Babylonians are thinking. Because the Babylonians have a polytheistic system and the Jews do not. The point here is that, again, it's not a coincidence that the faces correspond to these 4 corners, so to speak, or these 4, cardinal points that are important, again, to encompass all of the wheels of time that were, related to the zodiac, because astronomers watched the course of the zodiac constellations move through the sky during a given year. They used it to map time. And again, if you're a Jew, you're thinking, well, Genesis, the Torah says that God gave us these things, for times and seasons. Again, just, to map out the calendar, map out time. And when you have this imagery about the movement of time, it speaks of the movement of history. It speaks of what's happening through time, over time, in real time to the people here on earth. And the message of Ezekiel is very, very simple. It isn't Marduk on the throne, even though we're sitting here by the river Kavar in Babylon. It's Yahweh of Israel. Anyone, whether they're a Jew or a Babylonian, Babylonians probably would have been offended, but they're all going to know what this means. This means this is a vision pointing to who is sovereign over human history, who is sovereign over the events on earth and the course of time. It is not Marduk of Babylon. It is Yahweh of Israel, which would have been a tremendously significant thing, for a Jew to hear. Look at where they're at, just in terms of application to them and to us. because we need to remember these things too. The Jews sitting by the river Kavar, this is the worst of time for them. We are God's people. What in God's name are we doing in exile in Babylon? How could this possibly have happened? Yeah, we know intellectually that, the prophets had told us it was because of our idolatry and our sin and blah, 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 blah. We're here. But how in the world? We have these covenants. How could this have happened to us? Well, it did. And the prophets did tell you why. And so it can't get much worse than this. But the message again is God is still in control. And it's temporary. I mean, let's go to just a passage in Jeremiah, again, that would have, I think, driven this home. Jeremiah and Ezekiel prophesying, their ministries overlap. So the exiles are going to have heard this too. Jeremiah 25, behold, God is speaking, behold, I will send for all the tribes of the north, declares the Lord, and for Nebuchadnezzar the king of Babylon, my servant, and I will bring them against this land and its inhabitants, and against all these surrounding nations. I will devote them to destruction. Let me stop there. That is the same karem language that is used, same verb, that is used in the conquest of Joshua to eliminate the giant clans. The worst of the worst. It's applied here to the people of God. Okay, because of their betrayal. You can't get any worse in terms of the language here. I will devote them to destruction and make them a horror, a hissing, and an everlasting desolation. Moreover, verse 10, I will banish them from the voice of mirth and the voice of gladness, the voice of the bridegroom and the voice of the bride, the grinding of the millstones and the light of the lamp. This whole land shall become a ruin and a waste, and these nations shall serve the king of Babylon 70 years. Direct reference to the exile. But then look at what he says. Then after 70 years are completed, I will punish the king of Babylon and that nation, the land of the Chaldeans, for their iniquity, declares the Lord, making the land an everlasting waste. I will bring upon that land all the words that I have uttered against it, everything written in this book which Jeremiah prophesied against all the nations. Again, the point is, it's the end of the passage, but the point is they're suffering because of their sin, but they're not entirely forsaken. It was temporary. As bad as they had been, God wasn't giving up on them. And God would repay evil as well. Evil's not getting away with anything either. So God, he knew their circumstances. He wants them to know, yeah, I know you're here. I know why you're here. You know why you're here. But I want you to, Ezekiel's call is about confirming the idea that this is not going to be forever. This is temporary. God is still in control. And it's your God. It's not somebody else's God. It's your God that's still in control. So whether your suffering is deserved or not, again, we need to think in these terms too, whether our suffering is deserved or not, God is in control and we won't be forgotten. And evil will get what's coming to it. So it's really a significant, kind of message that Ezekiel 1 communicates to us. If you're interested, again, in some of the sort of the nitty-gritty stuff in the PDF, there's some links, and again, that excerpt about the imagery of the lion, the eagle, the bull, and the human, how they correspond to the zodiac, elements. If you're interested in that, there's a lot you can read on that. Again, there's links to somebody named Franz Boll, who's kind of famous for this in his astrological approach to the book of Revelation. I want you to please read the link because I would agree with the link's criticism of Boll. And you've heard me say this as well. We're going to end with this. Boll was a German classical philologist, a classic scholar who specialized in ancient astronomy and astrology and that sort of thing. But he goes too far in how he approaches Revelation, how he approaches biblical prophecy, and this sort of thing. But the opposite of that is also untrue. Boll and others might overstate the data for this approach, but the people who deny that there's anything to it equally overstate their position. There is something to this. Okay, ancient Near Eastern astronomy and Jewish astronomy has something to do with Ezekiel 1 and the book of Revelation, some of these other things I've talked about on the podcast and on my website. There is something to this. There's something going on here, and it does telegraph important theological ideas. But those theological ideas are different when it comes to biblical writers than they are to the pagans. And if you're interested in this sort of thing, you get a few more resources in the PDF. But for our purposes here, we're focused on Ezekiel 1. This is the message of Ezekiel 1. He is not seeing a UFO. He's not seeing anything bizarre. A Jew, a Babylonian, would have known what this was. A Jew would have known it's drawn from Torah. It's drawn from descriptions of the temple. It's amalgamated together in a heavenly vision. And frankly, the New Testament authors, John, writing book of Revelation, he was a Jew, he knew it. It goes right into the book of Revelation in the same way, telegraph the same things, same context, divine council meeting, the whole 9 yards. Again, God is on the throne. He controls every corner of the earth, and he controls all the heavens. He controls everything, and that's the point.
Mike, we really need to rename the show title to Debunking Ezekiel's UFO, because it's a well, it's just a shame that people twist that and spin it to UFOs when it seems so logical that the text says what it is, and to spin it into a UFO and make it something that it's not is just such a shame that so many people prey upon that.
Yeah, well, we could stick it in the title or the description. I will leave that to your. I'll make that an editorial decision on your part.
Yeah, no, but that's it's good. I mean, I think that's why a lot of people voted for Ezekiel, especially for this chapter, because it is out of the gates so controversial in a sense that I think a lot of people are going to walk away from this episode with a more clear understanding.
Yeah, it'll certainly be different. I mean, they're boring passages. Who cares what was in the temple? Who cares what it looked like? Who cares how they built? But it only matters when you see it again repurposed in a passage like this. Well, then yeah, it is important because it helps you avoid this crazy idea over on the other side.
Absolutely. Well, all right, Mike. Next week we're going to cover chapters 2 and 3. Is that correct?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Well, with that, Mike, I just want to thank everybody for listening to the Naked Bible Podcast. God bless.
Thanks for listening to the Naked Bible Podcast. To support this podcast, visit www.nakedbibleblog.com. To learn more about Dr. Heiser's other websites and blogs, go to www.drmsh.com.